The music world mourns the loss of one of rock's most iconic drummers, Rush's Neil Peart. Rediscover his Hall of Fame career and celebrate his life. This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart. Now, here's renowned journalist and SiriusXM host David Frick.
You are in the deep tracks, and this is Closer to the Heart, a special 2-hour tribute to Neil Peart, the drummer and lyricist of Rush, who we lost on January 7th at the age of 67 after a 3-year battle with brain cancer. I'm David Frick, your host for this very special program, and it is an honor to be here paying tribute to Neil, to his lifelong bandmates, bassist, singer Geddy Lee, and guitarist Alex Lifeson. I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Rush, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s when I was covering the band for Circus magazine and then Rolling Stone. I'm proud to say, one of the few critics who got them, who understood where they were coming from, and really had great contact, great conversations with them about making music, about going out there and connecting with fans, and doing it even though there were a lot of folks in the music industry, at record labels, at radio, in the press, who weren't there for them, and the fans were. I was lucky enough to experience a lot of that, and I'm going to be telling some of those stories as we go along. We're going to be playing lots of music by Rush, featuring Neil's lyrics, his extraordinary drumming, something that was almost taken for granted by a lot of, even by fans, because he was always there keeping the beat, keeping it moving, but he was a very inventive and complex drummer, and a lot of the exploratory character of Rush's music was down to the way Neil played drums and kept that music moving in so many ingenious and powerful ways. We're going to start with a song that I think captures a lot of what Neil and Rush wanted to do to connect with folks, to play music that was special for them and at the same time they thought would be special for many other people. The song is, of course, Closer to the Heart. Ironically, it's a song that features an additional lyricist, a friend of Neil's named Peter Talbot. He contributed lyrics to this song along with Neil, and of course Geddy and Alex wrote the music. It comes from an album released in 1977. It is now aptly titled A Farewell to Kings. This is Closer to the Heart, a special tribute to Neil Peart, and we open with the song Closer to the Heart.
To start to mold a new reality, closer to the heart, closer to the heart. The blacksmith and the artist reflected in their art. They forged their creativity closer to the heart. Yes, closer to the heart. Philosophers and plowmen, each must know his part to sow a new mentality closer to the heart. Yes, closer to the heart. Yeah. Oh.
This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart on Deep Tracks. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host David Frick.
Closer to the Heart, the theme song of our very special 2-hour tribute to drummer Neil Peart of Rush. You are in the Deep Tracks. I am David Frick. We are going to spend these next 2 hours celebrating a man that sadly we lost on January 7th, Neil Peart of Rush, to glioblastoma, a rather aggressive form of brain cancer. Neil was battling that for the last 3 years, and we certainly send out deep condolences to Neil's family and certainly to his lifelong bandmates Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. In a statement released last week, Geddy and Alex called Neil, quote, their friend, soul brother, and bandmate over 45 years, and said he had been, quote, incredibly brave in his battle with cancer. We ask that friends, fans, and media alike understandably respect the family's need for privacy and peace at this extremely painful and difficult time. They also added, those wishing to express their condolences can choose a cancer research group or charity of their choice and make a donation in Neil Peart's name. Rest in peace, brother. Tributes obviously poured out across social media and elsewhere in the wake of Neil's passing. Lars Ulrich, drummer of Metallica, went on social media, said simply, thank you, Neil. Thank you for inspiring me and for all your help and advice along the way, especially in the early days when you took the time to talk to a young, green Danish drummer about recording gear and the possibilities that lay ahead. Thank you for what you did for drummers all over the world with your passion, your approach, your principles, and your unwavering commitment to the instrument. And Dave Grohl and Taylor Hawkins of Foo Fighters, both drummers, went on social media to express their grieving and also their joy at knowing Rush, knowing Neil, and having the music to inspire them. Taylor Hawkins simply said, Neil Peart had the hands of God. End of story. And Dave Grohl, who got his big start in the limelight in the drum seat for Nirvana, he said, I still vividly remember my first listen of 2112 when I was young. It was the first time I really listened to a drummer, and since that day, music has never been the same. He was called the Professor for a reason. We all learn from him. Neil Peart. We will be talking a lot about Neil's songwriting, his lyrics for Rush, but certainly his drumming was what got him noticed right away. And let's do something that gets right to the heart of his legacy as a player. This is an instrumental from the 1981 album Moving Pictures, and it's called YYZ, or Z. It is the airport code for Rush's hometown of Toronto.
Fly by night
remembering one of rock's most celebrated drummers. This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host, David Frick.
Fly By Night, the title track from the second album by Rush, 1975, and Neil Peart's first album with the band. He replaced drummer John Rutsey, who played on Rush's self-titled debut album. This is Closer to the Heart in the Deep Tracks, a special 2-hour tribute to Rush drummer Neil Peart. I'm your host, David Frick. We lost Neil on January 7th at the age of 67, but we are here to celebrate his music, his life, and his legacy through stories and a lot of music from Rush's very long career in the studio and on stage. Neil Elwood Peart was born on September 12th of 1952 in Hamilton, Ontario. He grew up in Ontario and pretty much immediately wanted to be a drummer. His earliest influences included great big band jazz drummers Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich, and he also, needless to say, got extremely interested in the drumming that was coming out of England. Hard rock and progressive rock drummers such as Ginger Baker, The Who's Keith Moon, Led Zeppelin's John Bonham. When Neil was 18, he actually went to England on his own to seek his fortune there as a drummer. Things didn't turn out quite as well as he had hoped, but he was back in 1972. He worked at his father's farm equipment dealership for a while, but he was also playing with a lot of local bands, ultimately connecting with Geddy and Alex and becoming part of Rush. We're going to play a couple of things that reflect Neil's influences as a drummer, and this next one is particularly big for Neil. This is Led Zeppelin with John Bonham at the kit, the opening track from the 1969 album Led Zeppelin, Good Times,
the summertime. The summertime blues. Summertime.
Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart continues on Deep Tracks. Now, with more memories, here's David Frick.
From the 2004 EP, appropriately named Feedback, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart of Rush covering Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues in the inimitable style of Blue Cheer. Just a good example of the influences running through so much of Rush's music in the early 70s and well beyond that. This is Closer to the Heart, a special 2-hour tribute to Neil Peart. You're in the Deep Tracks. I'm your host, David Frick. Before that, one of Neil's very important influences, John Bonham of Led Zeppelin. John with Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and John Paul Jones. Their first album as Led Zeppelin, released in January 1969. The opening track, Good Times, Bad Times. In the liner notes to Feedback that Neil wrote, he mentioned that, ironically, I first heard many of these songs as cover tunes played by the local bands around St. Catharines, Ontario in the mid-60s. The Who and the Yardbirds were both introduced to me that way. A couple of years later, my own first band called Mumblin' Something from a Little Abner comic, I shall forever have to explain, played Cream's Crossroads and the Blue Cheer version of Summertime Blues. When Neil Peart joined Rush in 1974, he was signing up for something akin to going on a long march with the Canadian Army. The previous drummer, John Rutsey, who had played on Rush's first album, had left the band after a very long American tour on behalf of that first record. I remember when I interviewed the band for Rolling Stone in 1981, Alex Lifeson told me this wonderful story about that first U.S. tour. He, Geddy, and John Rutsey, they rented a car in Toronto on the pretense of driving it up north for a few gigs. Instead, the band went to the States for several weeks of shows opening for Kiss and Aerosmith. And as Alex told me, we brought the car back with 11,000 miles on it. It didn't have any hubcaps left. The radio was smashed. The mirror was gone. It was ruined. They were quite surprised. It was that kind of a tour that basically led John Rutsey to decide that, touring, especially to that extent, was not the life for him, and he left the group. When Neil joined, Geddy and Alex were pretty much writing all of the music and the words, but Neil ended up becoming the lyricist because, as Neil put it, the other two guys didn't want to write lyrics, although Neil always said that he considered the band's lyrics, quote, secondary to the music. In fact, I think the lyrics were an important part of Rush's emotional connection to their audience. And although, some of the earlier lyrics that Neil wrote were in that kind of concept of Dungeons and Dragons style, things like By Tour and the Snow Dog on Fly By Night, Neil was also growing into a very incisive and sometimes autobiographical writer. The song we're going to play next from the third album by Rush, Neil's second with the band, Caress of Steel, included a song called Lakeside Park, which was based on his own experiences as a teenager working amusement concessions at a place called Lakeside Park on the shores of Lake Ontario. He worked on games like the Bubble Game and Ball Toss. He was much more interested in playing in bands, so his concentration tended to waver when he was on the job. He was eventually canned. But that experience, and I think just the youthful dreaming that was a big part of his teenage life, came through in the song Lakeside Park, which had the chorus, Lakeside Park, willows in the breeze, Lakeside Park, so many memories, laughing rides, midway lights, shining stars on summer nights. Neil Peart in Lakeside Park. This is Lakeside Park from the album Caress of Steel on Closer to the Heart. You are in the deep tracks, and this is Rush.
Heaven
together. Though it's just a memory, some memories last forever.
is Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart on Deep Tracks. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host David Frick.
Neil Peart's take on the French Revolution, Bastille Day, originally featured on the 1975 album Caress of Steel, that version recorded live on home turf, Massey Hall, Toronto, Canada in June 1976, and featured on the 1976 live album All the World's a Stage. You are in the Deep Tracks with Closer to the Heart, a 2-hour tribute to drummer and lyricist Neil Peart of Rush. I'm your host, David Frick, and it is about time to move to the record that I believe is pretty much the one that started it for most people who count themselves in the Rush community. It's the record that actually changed everything for the band, if not critically, then certainly commercially, and set them on a path that would be important to them throughout their career in the studio. That record, of course, is 2112, named after the 20-minute suite on side 1 that became such an important part of the band's live shows and was right there right until the last touring in 2013, 14, 15. We are going to play the overture and the opening lyric piece, Temples of Syrinx, from that album. It's worth pointing out, though, that 2112 almost did not get made. Caress of Steel, which also featured a side-long suite, did not do well in record stores. Radio did not play it. Critics, needless to say, weren't on board. And Mercury Records, the band's label, was actually thinking of dropping them. Rush instead doubled down and decided to really go full-blown conceptual with 2112, and particularly the title track. 20 minutes long, futuristic science fiction in 7 parts. The story was written by Neil, who credited, quote, the genius of Ayn Rand in the liner notes. Rand was a Russian-born Jewish-American novelist who wrote the 1937 fictional novella Anthem, which, by the way, was the name of Rush's Canadian record label and management company. Rand wrote a lot about a philosophy she called objectivism, dealing with dystopia, capitalism, basically the upheaval in the world. And what Neil did in 2112 in the lyrics was create a dystopia of his own, one which, as I described it in my liner notes to a reissue of 2112 a few years ago, is empty of music and joy, run by a totalitarian priesthood that fears spontaneous expression and crushes individual spirit. Now, that may sound pretty familiar considering the state of what's going on in the world right now. Neil was writing this in 1975. As actually Leifson pointed out at one point, Neil will go off and work on the lyrics while Geddy and I sit together and throw ideas back and forth. Neil usually has 1 or 2 songs written before there are melodies to them, and that gets us started. We were pretty straightforward rock until 2112, he said. 2112 was like coming back with a vengeance, Alex said. That album still feels like that to me when I listen to it today. I can feel the hostility hanging out. This was Rush fighting back against critics, against the idea that they shouldn't be making the music they wanted, and they succeeded by getting it out there and proving that they were right all along. This is Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, the first 2 movements of 2112.
the meek shall inherit the earth. Cities full of hatred.
remembering one of rock's most celebrated drummers. This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host, David Frick.
A Farewell to Kings, the title track of the 1977 album. You are in the deep tracks with Closer to the Heart, a special tribute to Neil Peart, drummer, lyricist, lifelong bandmate for 45 years of Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. I'm your host, David Frick. We are celebrating the man, the legacy, and the music. We also heard the first two parts of the 7-part conceptual piece, 2112 Overture and the Temples of Syrinx, from the album that pretty much broke Rush wide open commercially, and certainly with their fan base, not just in Canada and America, but in England and Europe as well. A very important record for them, and one that they took on the road as many as 200 dates a year, just getting in the van, getting in the bus, and taking the message directly to the people, because at the time radio and print were not on board. One of the stories that I got to do early on with Rush was in January 1979. I went on the road with the band for 3 dates, starting in New Jersey, ending up in Pittsburgh, and I worked as a roadie. I worked as a roadie in Rush's crew. The idea was to really get a sense of life on the other side of the curtain, on the other side of all the work that goes into putting on a big arena show for fans. And Rush, to their credit, thought it was a great idea, and the crew welcomed me in a way that, I expected them to be cool, but they were really warm, they were very inviting, and they told me a lot of great stories, some of which I couldn't print, but most of which I could, and they were very grateful to the guys that employed them, Geddy, Alex, and Neil, for treating them right for all of the work that they did to make Rush such a special event for people when they came to town. One of the things that actually Neil's drum technician, Larry Allen, told me, he said, literally, print this. It's the band. They treat us right and pay us well. But more than that, we're all friends. I don't play drums myself, but Neil's offered to give me a few pointers. By the same token, I'm really into hockey, so I've turned Neil on to that. So much so that he's taken up skating. It's a relationship of mutual respect. Geddy, Alex, and Neil are the band, but they know they can't do it alone. They need someone there to make that guitar change, a quick one. In fact, at the Pittsburgh show, I got the chance to do the guitar change as the band came off from finishing up with 2112. I stood there at the side of the stage, and Alex ran in and handed me his Gibson, that beautiful wide-body Gibson guitar that he played on stage, and I had to hold it while he went backstage, got ready, and then came out for the encore medley of Working Man, Bastille Day, and In the Mood. It was one of the greatest moments of my rock and roll life to be at the side of the stage holding that guitar and waiting for Geddy, Alex, and Neil to come back out and just blow the fans away. This is a band that also, on the road, took a lot of care in making sure the sound was great, that they were going to be playing right every night. So they did really long sound checks. And believe it or not, one of the things they played in sound check was a 9-minute instrumental from the 1978 album Hemispheres. And it's also a great example of Geddy, Alex, and Neil playing together. Neil's drumming is so dynamic and complex, and yet it keeps pushing this music forward, giving Geddy and Alex a platform to really go to town. This is all 9.5 minutes of La Villa Strangiato.
Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart continues on Deep Tracks. Now, with more memories, here's David Frick.
From 1978, the album Hemispheres, a piece that featured every night on the tour that I saw in 79 when I worked as a roadie for Rush while I was there for Circus Magazine. La Villa Strangiato. I'm David Frick, and you are in the Deep Tracks with Closer to the Heart, a tribute to drummer and lyricist Neil Peart of Rush. We lost him on January 7th, but the memory and the music remain here in the Deep Tracks. We are going to move on to the next decade, really, and one in which Rush had a success that I don't think even they expected, particularly on radio. Rush was a band that really made its bones on the road and made its fans there as well, playing as many nights as they could, anywhere that they could for most of the 70s. When I was actually out with Rush for Circus Magazine again in the late winter of 1980, I was actually in Montreal with the band, and they were doing a radio appearance at CHOM FM in Montreal. And the DJ was on the air with Geddy, and he's looking through a pile of Rush albums. They're finishing up the interview, and he's looking through a pile of albums trying to find a track to play. And he finally looks up at Geddy with this like weird smile and says, "Let's go out with a hit." Well, Geddy genuinely looked puzzled at him and said, "A hit? We don't have any hits." Well, that was about to change. In 1980, with the album Permanent Waves and The Spirit of Radio. It was a top 30 hit in Canada, and the album was Rush's first top 5 album in the States. One of the things that Geddy talked about while I was on that trip with them about their trajectory was that he said basically, I think we achieved success a long time ago. The fact that we can go out and tour for 8 months and do exactly what we want to do, make the kind of records exactly the way we want to make them, that's my personal idea of success. And Neil actually said as much the same thing. He said, I think independence is the key in our terms. Once we'd achieved concert success, we could choose to headline in certain places and tour as long as we wanted to. Then for us, we're set. Everything we wanted to do in life, we're able to do. The Spirit of Radio is really a song about radio the way it ought to be, and the way we try to keep it going for you here at Sirius XM and the deep tracks. This notion that radio should be inspirational, that it should have stories to tell, and that the music can carry us forward through life, through changes, through difficulties, and into something that is both satisfying and something that we can share together. One of the things that Geddy said when I was on that tour with him, said, here was this band playing real raw stuff with a singer that had a real bizarre voice, and we're playing 7, 8, sometimes 20-minute tunes. I don't think we fitted into their plans, meaning radio programmers, and the long-time prejudice that many stations had against Rush at the time. But once that record took off, it could not be stopped. One of the promotion directors at that station in Montreal mentioned that when Rush's promo guy in Canada dropped off an advanced tape of the track Spirit of Radio, the station played it once. The station's request lines were jammed for days by kids calling for the song, despite the fact that the rep took the tape back after only one play on the air. This was a song that could not be stopped by a band that could not be stopped. Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and the late but always great Neil Peart. Rush from the album Permanent Waves, The Spirit of Radio.
you. Thank you very much. We'd like to do something now that deals with foreign matter. This is called A Passage to Bangkok.
This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart on Deep Tracks. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host David Frick.
Believe it or not, a song about weed. Not a topic that Neil Peart often wrote about, but he really nailed it in that one. A Passage to Bangkok, originally featured on the album 2112, but heard there in a live version from the Permanent Waves tour, June 17th of 1980 at the Manchester Apollo in Manchester, England. Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. Before that, The Spirit of Radio from the album Permanent Waves, the band's first major hit at home in Canada, their first major hit album in the U.S., and the start of a pretty important decade for Rush. You are in the Deep Tracks with Closer to the Heart, a tribute to drummer and lyricist Neil Peart of Rush. I'm your host, David Frick, and the next song is, hey, it's another hit. We don't have to go out with hits because we have plenty of them to keep going going for the next hour. This is a song that was featured on 1981's Moving Pictures, and it was a song that even Geddy Lee has called a defining piece of music, certainly from the early 80s, for Rush. It was written by Lee, Alex Lifeson, and drummer Neil Peart in collaboration with another lyricist, Pye Dubois, of the band Max Webster. The band was doing some rehearsing in a place outside Toronto, actually a farm owned by the rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins. And Dubois actually handed Neil a poem that he had written called Louis the Lawyer, that Neil then started working on developing himself and building into what became the song Tom Sawyer. As Neil described it in a 1985 Rush club newsletter, fan club newsletter, he said, Tom Sawyer was a collaboration between myself and Pye Dubois, an excellent lyricist who wrote the lyrics for Max Webster, another Canadian band who I often saw on the road with Rush. His original lyrics, Neil went on, were kind of a portrait of a modern-day rebel, a free-spirited individualist striding through the world wide-eyed and purposeful. I added the themes of reconciling the boy and man in himself and the difference between what people are and what others perceive them to be, namely me, I guess. In a 2007 interview, Alex Lifeson actually mentioned about his guitar solo, I winged it. Honest, I came in, did 5 takes, then went off and had a cigarette. I'm at my best for the first 2 takes. After that, I overthink everything, and I lose the spark. Actually, the solo you hear is composed together from various takes. Whatever it took, they got it. This is Rush from Moving Pictures 1981 with lyrics by Pye Dubois, Tom Sawyer.
A Monday warrior, mean, mean stride. Today's Tom Sawyer, mean, mean pride. Though his mind is not for him, don't put him down as arrogant. His reserve a quiet defense, writing out the day's events. Gets high on you, and the space he invades, he gets by on you.
Remembering one of rock's most celebrated drummers, this is Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host, David Frick.
From 1982, the album Signals, New World Man, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, Rush, on Closer to the Heart, a special 2-hour tribute to Rush drummer and lyricist Neil Peart. You are in the Deep Tracks. I'm your host, David Frick. New World Man, the biggest hit that Rush has ever had here in the U.S. It went to number 21 in Billboard in the fall of 1982, was number 1 on Billboard's top rock tracks chart, which was basically, FM rock airplay. It was a song that was written actually at the last minute for the Signals album. Believe it or not, the song came about after the band's producer Terry Brown pointed out that they didn't have enough material to even up the sides of what would have been the cassette version of the album. So they wrote and recorded the song in basically just a few hours, knocked it out, and suddenly, it's Hitsville for Rush. So it just goes to show you that songs can come, the best songs can come from the strangest places. We're actually going to go back to Rush, the instrumental powerhouse from the 1991 album Roll the Bones, a track called Where's My Thing. It actually had a subtitle called Part 4 Gangster of Boats Trilogy, which was born out of an inside joke that Geddy and Alex had when they threatened to name a Rush album Gangster of Boats if Neil had difficulty coming up with actually a good one. And the fact that it was in fact the fourth part of a trilogy. In any case, it was their first instrumental on record since YYZ, or Z, from Moving Pictures, and they wanted to do one for a previous album called Presto, but every time that Alex and Geddy had a piece of music, Neil came up with a great lyric for it. This time around, Neil just let the two write the instrumental track and deliberately avoided giving them any lyrics, and that way they had just this fantastic showcase of their playing together. Not only were they great friends and touring bandmates, but they had an empathy as players that allowed them to play incredibly complex, progressive hard rock music, but do it with an ease and a fluidity that I think most bands should envy. This is Rush from the album Roll the Bones. In the deep tracks, you are here with Closer to the Heart, and this is Where's My Thing?
Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart continues on Deep Tracks. Now, with more memories, here's David Frick.
From 1970, the original version of a single by The Who, The Seeker, that Rush covered on their Psychedelic Hits EP Feedback in 2004, but also a song that I think captures an important and difficult part of Neil Peart's life in the late 90s into the new century, as he dealt with heavy personal loss and actually considered retiring from Rush entirely. This is Closer to the Heart, a tribute to Neil Peart. You are in the Deep Tracks. I'm your host, David Frick. Before that, Rush, Where's My Thing, getting crazy and playful instrumentally from the album Roll the Bones. In 1997, when Rush was finishing up their Test for Echo tour, Neil Peart's daughter, his first daughter at the time, Selena, who was 19, was killed in a car accident in Ontario. 10 months later, Neil's partner of the previous 23 years, Jacqueline Taylor, died of cancer. Peart basically told his bandmates at Selena's funeral, quote, "Consider me retired." And in fact, he did just basically go off the rock and roll grid. He took a very long sabbatical to basically mourn and consider so much of what had happened to him. He traveled extensively by motorcycle through North and Central America, covering 55,000 miles, and wrote about that trip in a book called Ghost Rider, Travels on the Healing Road. At some point along that journey through reflection, Neil was introduced to a photographer, Carrie Nuttall, and they married in September 2000. In early 2001, Neil told Getty and Alex he was ready to return to recording and performing. That return was the 2002 album Vapor Trails. From the remixed version of that album, because people complained that, the mix was really weird, so Rush went back and remixed it for release in 2013, and it sounds pretty hot, but you can also hear Neil coming back from some very heavy darkness into light with his bandmates in this song, One Little Victory.
This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart on Deep Tracks. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host David Frick.
Recorded live on the last date of the tour for the 2002 album Vapor Trails, that date being November 23rd, 2002 at Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro for something like 200,000 people. I've been in that stadium. It is enormous, especially when it's full. That is Rush with a track that they originally recorded for their debut album just before Neil joined the band, but stayed in the set lists all the way through. Working Man, you can find that on the 2003 album Rush in Rio. Before that, One Little Victory, a song from the Vapor Trails album, the remixed version from 2013. Remixed because the band felt that the original issue didn't quite live up to the sound they heard in the studio, and highly recommended because it gets closer to what they really wanted to hear when they cut that record, One Little Victory, from that album. This is Closer to the Heart, a tribute to Neil Peart, the drummer and lyricist in Rush. We lost him on January 7th, but we keep it alive. We keep him and the music, the lyrics, and the stories alive here in the Deep Tracks. I'm your host, David Frick. When Rush retired in 2015, it was in many ways because I think Neil had been coming to the end of his ride as a drummer. He was suffering from tendonitis. He had shoulder problems, and it was just it was a hard life to be on the road and play that intensely with Rush. But they did go out with one last studio album in 2012 called Clockwork Angels, a very complex and intricate record that featured string arrangements by David Campbell, who happens to be the father of singer-songwriter Beck. One of the things that Neil once told me in an interview, and this was actually when I was writing about them for Rolling Stone in 1981, he was talking about, just Rush's approach to music, to presentation, the touring, production, their artwork. And one of the things Neil said was, we are not excessive. If something has our name on it, we try to make it as good as we can. We always think of the ideal Rush fan. When I'm writing lyrics or when I'm playing on stage, this ideal fan is watching every move I make to see if I make a mistake or if something is not as good as it should be. You just can't escape that judgment. And Rush, and especially Neil, followed that judgment all the way. This is the title suite from the album Clockwork Angels, Rush's 19th and final studio album, released in June of 2012. And just here it is, all 7.5 minutes of it. Rush in the Deep Tracks, Clockwork Angels.
remembering one of rock's most celebrated drummers. This is Closer to the Heart, the music of Neil Peart. Now, back to rock journalist and SiriusXM host, David Frick.
The title suite from Rush's 19th and final studio album released in June of 2012, Clockwork Angels. This is Closer to the Heart. You are in the deep tracks with a special tribute to drummer and lyricist Neil Peart of Rush, who passed away on January 7th at the age of 67. But we remember him here in the deep tracks, and he is always present in the music, the writing, and everything he left behind. 19 studio albums, as I mentioned, several live albums, which bring you the excitement and dimension of Rush in concert. And there are also films, classic album, documentaries about 2112 and moving pictures. Neil was also an author, in addition to writing the Ghost Rider Travels on the Healing Road book. He also wrote a book called The Masked Rider, Cycling in West Africa, written in 1996, about a bicycling tour he took through Cameroon in November of 1988. He also wrote a third book, Traveling Music, playing back the soundtrack to My Life and Times, in which he reflected on his life, his family, career, and his band. And there's simply the music, and basically there is the music, and there is everything that he brought to the stories that he wanted to tell in songs. And I want to go out with something from the album Moving Pictures. It's the last track on the album, and I think in many ways the lyrics to the song capture what Neil believed in and what he tried to get across through Rush in the music, and to help everyone carry forth in life through the day to something better. The song opens going, "Unstable condition, a symptom of life in mental and environmental change, atmospheric disturbance, the feverish flux on human interface and interchange." That's a pretty dense mouthful, and yet the way it's sung by Geddy, the way the band projects those words musically, you can really feel that sense of tension and that impatience with moving forward. A tired mind become a shapeshifter. Everybody need a soft filter. Everybody need reverse polarity. Neil goes at the end. Everybody got mixed feelings about the function and the form. Everybody got to elevate from the norm. The words of Neil Peart, the music of Rush. You have been listening to Closer to the Heart, a tribute to Neil Peart in the deep tracks. I'm David Frick, and we go out with a song that pretty much says it all. Vital Signs. Thanks very much for joining me, and goodbye, Neil.
Unstable condition, a symptom of life in mental and environmental change, atmospheric disturbance,
been listening to another SiriusXM subscriber exclusive, Closer to the Heart, the music of Rush's Neil Peart, a celebration of a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame career with SiriusXM host David Frick. Hear it again on demand on the SiriusXM app, now included free for most subscribers.